Gittin Daf Ayin Tes Amud Beis, our relationship to the planet. Zu Lifnim Mizu. We have the two conflicting psukim in Tehillim. The Gemara in Brochus Daf Lamed Hey talks about it. Le David Mizmor La Hashem Haaretz Meloat V'Yoshveva. Hashem owns the whole world, the whole universe. Everything is Hashem's. And Hashemayim Shamayim L'Hashem V'Haaretz Natan Livnei Adam. And we're also told in Perek Haftes Vov in Tehillim that Hashem has given us the world. So what is our relationship to the world? Is it ours or is it Hashem's? Are we guests in the world or does Hashem own the world? And the Gemara in Brochus talks about one before a brocha, after a brocha, but we're going to get a new understanding of our relationship to the world and to ownership of the world through explaining a Rashbo in this piece of Gemara in Gittin, which on the surface seems to have nothing to do with what we're talking about, and yet it'll be a good example of how we can understand principles from technical halachic details. The case here is Omar Abaye. Abaye gives us a case. Shtei chatserot zu lifnim mizu. There are two pieces of property, one surrounded by the other. So it's two, like if you think of concentric circles, there's a property in the middle and it is surrounded by another property. Pnimit shela v'chitzona shelo. The inner property is hers and the outer property is his. And the outer walls are higher than the inner walls. So you imagine the inner walls are 4 feet high and the outer walls are 10 feet high. And he threw the get to her. At what point does the divorce activate? Says Abaye, Kiven she'igia la'avir mechitzot hachitzona harezu megureshet. Difficult wording and a little bit ambiguous, but we'll go the simple way, the way most Rishonim go. Once it gets over her airspace into the area covered by the height of the outer walls. So if you can imagine, so he's thrown it from his property or from outside, and he's thrown this get, and it flies, or he sends it by drone, and the drone flies over his property into her property, but it's now 30 foot high. She's not divorced yet. The drone starts coming down. Is she divorced when it hits 10 feet or when it hits 4 feet? Because it has to be in a chatzera mishtamer. She needs control over the get, as we learned. And to have control, you've got to have a walled area. Because if it's not a walled area, if the get's in the air somewhere and it's not walled, a wind can come and can push it outside of the area altogether. She doesn't have control. But if it's a walled, a protected area, then even if it's in the airspace, the get works. So now the drone's coming down. It's down 20 feet, 15 feet, 10 feet, says Abaye, divorced. If the drone then catches a light and the get is destroyed, she's still divorced, even though she never got the get into her hand. That's called beyada. That's called into her hand. My timer. Pnimit gufa b'mchitzot hachitzona kamintera. Because those outer walls protect the inner property as well. They're also her walls. Very interesting. You can try and picture it. You get they make drawings of these of the scenario, but I know drawings make it easier, but they take it out of your head and put it on the paper. It's important to picture it, have in your mind, just picture it. It could be a medieval castle with an inner castle inside it, big wall in the outer castle, small wall in the inner castle, a drone flying over the top. Nowadays in Europe, drones are flying over castles and they're causing damage. So he doesn't want to cause damage, he just wants to deliver a get using a drone. What is the case? What does it mean that the outer walls also protect the inner case? Regila, says Rashi, lehishtamer. She is accustomed to being protected. Such a strange word. And you'll see in a moment why we've put the other version in brackets here. Hilkach mishu'abadot hein la. Therefore, those outer walls have a shibud. She has rights in them. They serve her too, although they're not on her property. Those outer walls serve her too, the kanula, and they can help create a protected yard, which is able to be koneh, to acquire the get as the drone descends through the 10-foot level. At that point, even though it hasn't reached the height of her walls are only 4 feet high, but at that point already the get works. Says the Rashbo, how does it work? It's all the Rishonim have difficulty with this. And he says, because אף על פי שלא נכנס עדיין בתוך גובה המחיצות הפנימיות כזה, מה טעם הפנימית גופה במחיצות החיצונה רגילה להשתמר? How can it work? The drone is not within her real territory. It's over her airspace, but it's not in a protected area because her walls only go 4 feet high and the drone's at 9 or 10 feet. How does it work? Says the Rashbo, Hilka chashvinan lehu lemechitzot pnimit ki'ilu hen gevohot kegovan shel chitzona uki'ilu higia get letoch aviran dami. We create a virtual extension of the wall. Look how modern this is. We're talking about drones and we're talking about virtual walls in the Rashbo. We extend the wall virtually. So there's a 4-foot actual wall and the next 6 feet of her wall, which we take from the outer wall, so to say, and we virtually add it onto her wall. So her wall is now, we perceive her wall to be 10 feet high. I was told, that's ridiculous. Because the fact that a virtual wall, you need a physical wall for get. Chatzera mishtameret, it must be protected. If a wind could still come and blow the drone into his territory, or blow the get into his territory after it drops, then it's not going to fall in her territory. That's not called the chatzera mishtameret. You say, but there was a virtual wall. Sorry, the wind didn't know there was a virtual wall. Sorry, the drone didn't see the virtual wall. Of course not, it's a virtual wall. What are you talking about, a virtual wall? It's still not her territory if it could easily blow into his territory. Therefore, Tosfos says, when we talk about the outer wall, we're not talking about a wall out of the outer circumference. It's he built a wall between him and her. In addition to her 4-foot wall, next to her 4-foot wall, he built a 10-foot wall. So now you can say the 10-foot wall serves her as well because it's on their boundary. That's how Tosfos learns it, which is difficult because that's not what the Gemara seems to be saying. So how do we understand Rashi and how do we understand the Rashbo? Rav Soloveitchik says, it seems clear from Rashi that a neighbor has physical rights in the property of his neighbor. We know that they have legal rights. If the outer perimeter, if the outer yard completely surrounds my property, how do I get in and out? So I have rights of passage. I'm allowed to walk through your property. There are various rights, we'll learn in Bava Basra, various rights that a neighbor has in the property next door, in the neighboring property. Says Rav Soloveitchik, you've got to say those rights are not rights in the Gavra. They are not rights that he has the right to. It's he has ownership in that property in as much as he may walk through it. That's how it works with an owner. So it's taking the rights of neighborhood, of neighborliness, whatever you call it, of being a neighbor, the rights of a neighbor, to more than I have a right to do certain things, I actually have a right of ownership. Now that ownership doesn't give me the right to go in and build on your property or to grow tomatoes on your property or to sell your property. It gives me none of those rights. It gives me the rights to walk through that property. But even that right is the chidush in Rav Soloveitchik is that right is a right in the body of the property. It's not just a right that I have, a legal right that I have. It's an ownership right. If it were not an ownership right, it wouldn't work for Gittin. So she's got ownership in those walls because those walls serve her as well. That service is more than a servitude. That service is actually giving her a right of ownership in those walls so that if the walls fall down, he has to rebuild them. That's not just because she has legal right, it's because she actually has ownership. She's a partner in those walls because the walls serve her as well. That's how Rav Soloveitchik learns it. The Rav Soloveitchik's idea is expressed in greater detail in a sefer called the Kikayon de Yona. The Kikayon de Yona was written by Rabbi Yona Frankel Tumim, he was known as, in the 17th century. So he's at the second generation after the Shulchan Aruch, after the Ramah, at the time of the Shach and the Taz and the Bach. It's that next generation, very great generation, that he writes. Interestingly enough, his second wife was the granddaughter of Reb Shaul Val. Reb Shaul Val is the famous story, he was the king of Poland for a day. There was a constitutional crisis in Poland and he was very friendly with one of the princes and they couldn't find the next king in the amount of time they needed within 21 days and they still hadn't found anybody, and it was suggested that they make him caretaker king. And he took the job for a day, and during that day he undid a whole lot of the laws against the Jews, which remained that way afterwards. And then he took a part in actually deciding who the next king would be. It was a very important day in the Jewish history of Poland, and that was the grandfather of the Kikayon de Yona's second wife. And he writes that you've got to say here, Well, firstly, the interesting thing that he says, and there are people who quote this Kikayon de Yona, but it seems to be that people didn't look into it. They just quoted because somebody else quoted it and somebody else quoted it. If you look into the Kikayon de Yona, amazingly, he has a different girsa in Rashi. And that's why I put that word lihishtamesh. Rigila lihishtamesh. She has a tradition, a chazaka of shimush, of using that outer yard. What for? To gain passageway. It's not lihishtamesh. Lihishtamesh, which answers Tosfos' questions, which we won't go into. It makes a huge difference. And the Kikayon de Yona says she can walk through it. And for example, if she dropped something, and it was hefker, would normally have been hefker, and she drops it on the pathway to her house, he doesn't acquire it because it's in his chatzer. It's not considered his chatzer in as much as she has ownership in that chatzer as well. So he gives another example, almost for the same idea that Rav Soloveitchik develops many centuries later, that she has ownership in that piece of property. It's not just rights of usage in that piece of property. What we see here, and that's the meaning when Rashi says, it's not that she has a particular deal with the husband's property, with a shibud, as Tosfos understands it. No. She has regular usage rights, and that gives her ownership rights in that property sufficient so that if the get would blow in that direction, it's not a big deal because she still has ownership in that direction, in that area as well. So when I learned this piece of Gemara, and I thought to myself, so what's for us? What does this teach us? It's very nice. We've learned a piece of Gemara. We've learned Abaya's halacha, a very interesting one, an unusual case study. We learned a difficult Rashi. There's a Tosfos that goes into the Rashi, disagrees with the Rashi. We've got a Rashbo, which is strange, and we've got a resolution to the Rashbo from the Kikayon de Yona, that when the Rashbo says we extend the virtual walls, it's not that we extend the virtual walls as such, it's just that the outer walls are her walls as well. And therefore when the drone comes into her property, that's already her property because she has ownership interest in the outer part of it. What does it teach us? It teaches us two things that are very important. The one is, if I have some rights of usage in your property, I have some ownership. I'm a partner of yours in some way. And that teaches us something about the universal nature of the world. We all have rights. What you do in your property affects me. It affects all of us. Whether you plant trees or you break your trees down, whether you pollute or you don't pollute, what you do in your property affects me. I have certain rights in your property and in your life. And therefore, the idea that it's none of my business, what you do is none of my business, what you do ethically, morally, physically, geographically, none of my business, not true. It's all of our businesses. We all have business in each other's businesses. We're all partners in each other's businesses, and there's a level of ownership. Just as if she in the inner court, because she has the rights of passageway, gets some sort of a right of ownership, so we all have certain rights in each other's property, and therefore we have some rights of ownership, and all of humankind are partners in each other's properties to some degree, and we have to look at the world that way. But it goes further than that as well, and that is to understand Hashem owns the whole world. Think of it as that outer property because we've discovered a new form of ownership in the outer property. Who owns the outer property? The husband owns it. Can he trade it? He can trade, he can plant things in it, he can build on it, he can do what he wants on it. But she has certain rights in it as well. Hashem ha'aritzim lo'ah is like the husband's ownership of the outer property. It belongs to Hashem. The world belongs to Hashem. Va'aretz natan livnei adam. But we have a share in it. We have certain rights in the world. And those rights in the world give us real ownership. It's natan livnei adam. It doesn't say that Hashem lent us the world. Hashem allows us to use the world. It says natan. Hashem gave it to us. We have ownership and responsibility in the world, but only to do certain things. Just as she has ownership, but only to walk through it. And that ownership is enough to give her rights in the walls, and that makes a protection and all sorts of things. So the world, the planet, is ours in as much as we can work with it. We can be productive in it. We can be koine, we can acquire things, we can trade with things. We have those rights in the world, and they're rights of ownership. But we've never to forget that La'aretz Hashem Lo'ah, the real owner of the world, is Hashem, and He's only given us the rights of passage. You can use it as you pass through your life, and then you leave it behind. You leave it for the next generation. This is my world, not yours. You're not taking it anywhere. You only have rights of passage. And yes, that gives you ownership during your lifetime. But if the woman leaves the inner property and sells it and goes somewhere else, she's got no rights left in the outer property. It's only while you're there, while you're in the world and using it for avodat Hashem, le'ovda u'leshomra. You've got to protect the world and develop the world and do it in a way which is al pi Torah, le'ovda u'leshomra, as we learn in Bereshit. The conditions under which we were given any ownership at all of the planet is that we use it le'ovda u'leshomra, that we're using it for avodat Hashem, and everything that we do, we own it only for passageway. And while we're using it for passageway, we've got to use it for that which it was given to us, to serve Hashem and to be mekadesh Shem Shemayim in the world around us.